But at least you're replacing part of that signal and keeping your testicular function and adrenal function going at maximum capacity, I would say. Vigorous Steve here. In this video, I want to explore and discuss several different compounds which could form the base of a performance-enhancing drug protocol. Because I'm sure, as many of you are aware, that when you start taking exogenous compounds which potentiate anabolism through the androgen receptor, that the hypothalamic pituitary testis axis shuts down, right? You might still have somewhat of detectable testosterone levels, but those are coming from neurosteroid conversion, being pregnenolone and DHEA. That process, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, doesn't completely downregulate and shut down. You will still produce a decent amount of DHEA and pregnenolone in the adrenal glands, converting into testosterone and estradiol downstream. But your testicular function will certainly shut down unless you put particular compounds in place to sustain that when you take compounds that potentiate anabolism through the androgen receptor. So I want to explore all of that in this video. This is not going to be an epic steroid battle. This is going to be a battle of the bases. And when I say bases, I don't mean drum and bass or baking soda. I mean anything that could somehow sustain sex hormone and neurosteroid levels in the body. So we're going to discuss testosterone, Clomid, ACG, HMG, DHEA and pregnenolone supplementation. And I also want to explore Nandrolone, Dianabol, and injectable estradiol, Valerate, and Benzoate. But before we get into it, please like the video, leave a comment for the algorithm, and consider subscribing if you haven't already. Now, first things first, I have experimented with kisspeptin 10 in the past, both when I was anabolic androgenic steroids free with a normal functioning HPTA, in which case dosages between 100 micrograms 3 times per week up until 1,000 micrograms right before drawing blood for analysis. In that scenario, kisspeptin 10 was ineffective for me, and I replicated the same protocol when I was using testosterone and primobolan, and both had conservative dosages. Also no effect. Both my luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone levels did not budge in both experiments. So from all the compounds that we can choose from at the moment, I'm going to leave the kisspeptin 10 and the gonadotropin hormone releasing hormone receptor agonist peptides out of the picture, because they either didn't work for me or I have limited experience with these compounds, and certainly not from a sustainability perspective. I mean, I've tried triptorelin in the past to recover HPTA functioning, but that was only in the context of 2 or 3 administrations of 50 micrograms each, spaced out over a multitude of days. So I haven't used buserelin or gonadorelin for a prolonged period of time, and I have no idea, or I can't confirm, that they're even going to work as a base of a protocol involving a multitude of performance-enhancing drugs. So let's just start with testosterone, because I know that is going to work. Testosterone is bioidentical. It's produced in the testicles and converted from neurosteroids, from DHEA into testosterone, and ultimately into estradiol. So for most of us, the large majority of the people taking performance-enhancing drugs, testosterone is going to form the base, right? When you take oral steroids, SARMs, or any other testosterone derivative or dihydrotestosterone derivative or 19-nor derivative, it's going to downregulate the HPTA, and natural testosterone production is going to decline unless you put in something in place like an ACG or HMG, which we'll also discuss a little bit later in this video. So from all the bases that we can choose, probably testosterone is the most forthcoming, the easiest to acquire. You can even get it on prescription. And 100 milligrams of testosterone, in most cases, is already going to replace endogenous testosterone production. Now, you're going to ask me, Steve, why would I shut down my endogenous testosterone production for 100 milligrams a test? Well, some guys produce even less, so they would be happy with 100 milligrams a test. And if you're not happy with 100 milligrams of testosterone per week, you can bump up the dose to wherever you feel the best, right? You get the best results with minimal side effects. And of course, increasing the dose of testosterone would yield more and more side effects, maybe up until a point where you can't even control these side effects anymore. So I'm sure everybody's familiar with testosterone, as am I. I feel all things considering test is still best. And if test is not best for you, then, well, stick around till the end while we're discussing Nandrolone as a base, perhaps with Dianabol in the picture. Second option you can look at, and is very common with some of the old school hormone replacement therapy clinics, is Clomiphene as a base. And nowadays we also have Enclomiphene, which might be a little bit more sustainable than actual clomiphene citrate. Clomiphene is a selective estrogen receptor modulator, as is Enclomiphene, which blocks the estrogen receptors in the hypothalamus and the pituitary, increasing the secretion of luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone. Now, I don't think that Clomiphene or Enclomiphene are going to sustain the secretion of LH and FSH from the pituitary when you increase the dose of testosterone to supraphysiological levels. So at 100 milligrams of exogenous testosterone, 25 to 50 milligrams of Clomid or Enclomiphene might still sustain LH and FSH secretion. So that's a combination of a base where the HPTA doesn't really downregulate. You still get LH and FSH levels promoting testicular function downstream, and the exogenous testosterone rises that to a little bit higher level than what you are able to produce naturally. And of course, some people take Clomiphene as a base and then maybe add a little bit of SARMs on top, which I do see some anecdotal evidence that works. People take 25 to 50 milligrams of Clomid per day or Enclomiphene, and then dose their SARM cycle a little bit conservatively. So in that sense, testicular function and HPTA is sustained. Testosterone levels might be comparable to where they were before SARMs were introduced, but they will never really be super physiological. And in some cases, as the dosages of SARMs are increased, or you start to dabble with the YK11, which is a steroidal SARM, then LH and FSH levels might still go lower and lower or bottom out, and Clomiphene or Enclomiphene is no longer effective. So it might be useful to do up until a certain dose or limited to certain compounds, but you're blocking the estrogen receptors in the eyes, and a lot of people get ocular changes from this, which might last for weeks to months after discontinuing the Clomiphene or the Enclomiphene. Now, Enclomiphene is, again, not that invasive regarding the ocular changes as Clomid is, but right, you don't want to be the guy that gets long-lasting side effects because you wanted to run a SARM cycle with Enclomiphene to sustain HPTA function and normal testosterone, estradiol, DHEA, and pregnenolone levels. And then you discontinue your cycle and, well, you see all these tracers or blurry vision, etc. So I don't think it's a sustainable approach. I know it's being prescribed at certain hormone replacement therapy clinics or as a start of seeing if the HPTA is the missing link or the pituitary is not functioning accordingly, right? It's very circumstantial, but I don't think that Clomiphene or Enclomiphene is a sustainable base to sustain testicular function and HPTA while you're taking exogenous testosterone derivatives, or SARMs. What I do think is sustainable is either ACG or HMG, which contains luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone, two bioidentical hormones otherwise produced in the pituitary gland. Now, when you go on ACG or HMG, you sustain part of the hypothalamic pituitary testis axis, the latter part, the testicular part, producing a decent amount of testosterone, estradiol, estrone, estriol, and DHEA and pregnenolone in the adrenal gland. Same for HMG. So if you take these compounds as a base, technically, you don't need exogenous testosterone, and you could add oral steroids, SARMs, or even some of the injectable testosterone derivatives or dihydrotestosterone testosterone derivatives or 19-nor derivatives, which I feel don't really work anymore with ACG or HMG. But technically, you could and completely forego testosterone, exogenous testosterone, as your base. But ideally, you take both. You take the lowest effective dose of testosterone and the lowest effective dose of ACG or HMG, and now you get pretty good levels of testosterone, estradiol, and all the other hormones. But if you don't want that, if you somehow adverse to the idea of testosterone or you don't want too much aromatization of testosterone into estradiol, then yes, you can use ACG or HMG as a base, and it's actually quite sustainable up until a certain dose of exogenous compound. So let's say you take 250 IUs ACG to sustain testicular function. You take that 3 times per week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. People do that as monotherapy and maybe increase their dosages up to 500 IUs 3 times per week, or 1,000 IUs 3 times per week, or even 1,000 IUs every day, depending on the serum testosterone levels, the estradiol, and however else you're trying to manage all the intermediary hormones. Maybe you're happy with that, and then you add in an oral on top, right? The ACG is your base. And even though taking ACG as your base is inevitably shutting down the hypothalamic pituitary testes axis, but at least you're replacing part of that signal and keeping your testicular function and adrenal function going at maximum capacity, I would say. And then the addition of an oral steroid or a SARM or another injectable compound up until a certain dose should yield pretty good results. Now, you don't use exogenous testosterone, but you're producing testosterone directly in the testicles. Now, I've read a lot of anecdotal reports on the message boards and I've experimented with this protocol myself in the past when the low-dose test and the high-dose tren, high-dose masteron cycles became popular. People wanted to mitigate some of the side effects which occurred at higher dosages of trenbolone, speculating that testosterone was getting kicked off the androgen receptor, so lowering the testosterone to a hormone replacement therapy dose or taking it out completely should mitigate some of the side effects, which is true. But some people wanted to see if they could get away with no test and use ACG instead, producing a decent amount of testosterone in the testicles and perhaps using an additional aromatase inhibitor to keep estradiol suppressed. Now, I've experimented with this myself. It works for a certain period of time. And then because the dosages of trenbolone and the amount of androgens in the body is so high, but testicular shrinkage and the potential desensitization or downregulation of the LACG receptors on the testicles still occurs, resulting in low levels of serum testosterone, serum estradiol, DHEA, and pregnenolone, semen volume, libido, and everything else that's positively associated with testicular function, just because the dosages of tren, being a progestogenic 19-nor potentiating effects through the androgen receptors and the progesterone receptors, another signal for downregulation and shutdown of the testicles, so to say, plus right, a lot of free androgens in the bloodstream because sex hormone binding globulin levels are probably very low as well. So in those cases, ACG, HMG is probably not effective anymore, and I've seen this on my blood work and many blood works of people who followed similar protocols, but it will be effective on a conservative dose of testosterone or compounds that don't potentiate additional effects through the progesterone receptor. So if you want to use ACG in the context of nandrolone, trenbolone, trestolone, unless you're dosing nandrolone extremely conservatively as a hormone replacement therapy dose of 100 milligrams to maybe 200 milligrams nandrolone per week, which is generally used as a relief compound when joint issues manifest on top of a testosterone base. And I feel in that scenario, ACG might still be sufficient, 250 IUs 3 times per week, 500, 1,000, whatever dose you feel is appropriate. It might be sufficient to sustain testicular function because the burden of the progestogenic 19-nor being nandrolone through the progesterone receptor is not high enough for testicular function to completely downregulate or shut down. Now, I feel that HMG is a little bit more potent than the ACG when using progestogenic 19-nors or reasonably higher dosages of testosterone, primobolan, boldenone, just a higher burden of androgens in the bloodstream, basically. I feel that HMG is a little bit more potent in that sense, more sustainable at higher dosages. From what I've heard, again, anecdotal reports, this is a little bit unexplored territory. I know guys that ran 75 IUs HMG every day and sustained their testosterone and estradiol levels while running pretty high dosages of Primo and Boldenone during a contest prep. Again, these are guys who are obviously very well off financially and have everything in place to sustain testicular function, being the HMG very expensive. But I've heard reports that it is sustainable as a base and keeps testosterone, estradiol, DHEA, and pregnenolone levels reasonably acceptable, considering that there's a ton of Primo and a ton of Boldenone in the picture. So I would only consider the HMG or ACG for that matter up until a certain dose, when the burden of non-testosterones become too great for your testicles to bear, basically, and the HMG or ACG becomes ineffective to sustain testicular function, then you would have to look into DHEA and pregnenolone supplementation. Again, if your body is non-responsive at a certain dose of anabolic androgenic steroids in total, then you'll need to supplement with DHEA and pregnenolone, because not only are the testicles non-responsive to the ACG or HMG, the adrenal glands will also be non-responsive. And even though adrenal function will still continue to a certain extent, right, you still need a decent amount of neurosteroids to help with the overall sense of well-being, memory formation, libido, even androgen receptor sensitivity are all regulated partially by the neurosteroids as well as the sex hormones. And of course, neurosteroids convert into sex hormones downstream. And if you don't take testosterone as a base, or Clomid as a base, or ACG as a base, or HMG as a base, and the whole picture completely falls apart because there's too much trenbolone, masterone, primobolan in the picture, without any of the other compounds which we discussed previously, because you don't want to take them or they appear to be ineffective in the long term, then you need to supplement oral DHEA and pregnenolone. 25 to 50 milligrams DHEA and 10 to 25 milligrams pregnenolone is more than sufficient for most people to have middle to top of the reference range DHEA sulfate, pregnenolone sulfate levels on blood work, as well as testosterone levels which are somewhat detectable, but they might still be subclinical. But hey, let's be fair, most of the anabolic androgenic steroids are testosterone derivatives and might be able to replace some of the physiological functions which testosterone produces. So in the context of a Nandrolone-only cycle, and ACG or HMG is not effective, or Enclomiphene is not effective, and you don't want to take testosterone, basically Nandrolone is your base, then I would supplement DHEA and pregnenolone at pretty high dosages, 50 milligrams DHEA and 25 milligrams pregnenolone, because assuming that the rest is not working anymore, the Nandrolone is probably quite steep also. So when I did my Nandrolone-only cycle, 1,000 milligrams of Nandrolone per week, which worked, albeit that I prefer 1,000 milligrams of testosterone per week, I had to supplement in the DHEA and pregnenolone just to have normal neurosteroid levels, somewhat detectable testosterone, and almost optimal estradiol levels. Because again, you want to have some testosterone in the picture and some DHEA and pregnenolone just to sustain estradiol, because it's the estradiol that is neuroprotective, helps you with your lipids, helps with blood pressure management, helps with libido, right? Ton of benefits of estradiol. And that's why it's very important to sustain at least parts or replace part of the HPTA and the HPAA for that matter, because we need estradiol. You shouldn't be estrogen phobic. Ideally, you keep your estrogen at least in the middle to the top of the reference range for overall sense of well-being and everything else that's positively associated with estradiol, right? If you go over the reference range, you're risking some side effects. If you go to the middle or lower than the reference range, you're risking some side effects, dry joints, cracked lips, poor libido, low empathy, right? So a lot of the things that we put into place, which are the base of a performance-enhancing drug protocol, are merely there to supply estrogen, or estradiol for that matter, right? Which is the bioactive form of estrogens in the male body, being estrone and estriol also present, but they don't fulfill any real physiological functions in the male body. And even though your body will know when your estrone levels are disproportionately lower to your estradiol levels, which you can manipulate with diindolylmethane, for example, which will metabolize the estradiol into estrone. And now you feel slightly better. I mean, it's very hard to pinpoint, but I do notice that when I put hormone replacement therapy guys using a low dose of testosterone and maybe a little bit of ACG in the picture, and when you go on ACG, you will produce estrone directly in the testicles and the adrenal glands potentially. So the proportion is a little bit less, but you're still converting testosterone into estradiol in the peripheral tissue, being the adipose tissue. If you add in a little bit of diindolylmethane metabolizing the excess estradiol into estrone, people feel better. And of course, it's a little bit hard to pinpoint if that's a lower estradiol level or a better ratio between the estradiol and the testosterone, or a better ratio between the estradiol and the estrone or estriol, because that's what diindolylmethane metabolizes the estradiol into estrone and estriol. But the hormone balance is more optimized this way. So with these tools at our disposal, being able to partially or fully sustain the HPTA and HPAA, supplying a nice balance between the sex hormones and the neurosteroids for normal physiological function, forming the base of a performance-enhancing drug protocol, which involves one or other compounds, we can basically look anywhere. Right? We can look into Primobolan on top of this base, or Nandrolone on top of this base, or oral steroids on top, or SARMs, or whatever else. As long as you're somehow sustaining the balance between sex hormones and neurosteroids and keep normal physiological function going, you can add on whatever until these particular practices don't work anymore, and then you probably need to go through the list, ending up at DHEA and pregnenolone supplementation. Of course, out of all the options at our disposal, it seems that exogenous testosterone at a low and effective dose in combination with a low and effective dose of ACG is the most straightforward. That seems to be well tolerated by the very large majority of the people that take performance-enhancing drugs and use the test and ACG to form their base. And then they can decide to add oral steroids, SARMs, or other injectables on top. And all they need to do is manage their estradiol, because some compounds like Nandrolone, for example, promote the conversion of testosterone into estradiol. And other compounds like Primobolan, Boldenone, Masterone, and some of the oral steroids even might suppress estradiol aromatization to a certain extent, especially at higher dosages or when the ratio between testosterone and ACG to the other compounds starts to skew when additional anabolism is desired. Right? So let's say you keep your testosterone at 100 milligrams, 200 milligrams per week, plus 250 IUs to 500 IUs ACG 3 times per week. That's your base, right? To supply adequate sex hormones and neurosteroid concentrations in the bloodstream, and then you start ramping up the Primobolan to 1,000 milligrams per week, for example, so it's quite disproportionate to the amount of test and ACG that you have in the picture, then estradiol levels might still be somewhat suppressed. So you either need to look into, additional DHEA and pregnenolone supplementation, right, to potentiate a little bit of conversion of the DHEA into testosterone into estradiol, or remove all of the compounds that could reduce aromatization even further, like Diindolylmethane, zinc, nicotine, and there's a lot of compounds that could lower aromatization. In some cases, those are desired, and in some cases, they're not desired, and your blood work will tell you what to do. So you always have to look into the total picture. If you're somehow non-responsive to testosterone, you're a poor responder, you get an adverse reaction at any dose, or serum concentrations of estradiol don't sit well with you also, right? There's a lot of variability involved, and some people just don't respond well to normal levels of sex hormones and neurosteroids, and they might need to downregulate the HPTA and downregulate and reduce neurosteroid production in the adrenal glands, and then continue through life with subclinical testosterone and estradiol levels, as well as estrone and estriol. Some people feel absolutely great with that. Some people prefer that and use Nandrolone as a base, or even Primobolan as a base instead. So you have subclinical neurosteroids and sex hormones in the bloodstream, but the Primobolan or Nandrolone is sufficient enough to keep the anabolism, the well-being, and everything else going, right? If you're doing this in the context of hair loss, then Primobolan is out of the picture. That's not hair safe. Then Nandrolone would be the only real injectable option that you have. Again, if hair loss is a concern for you, the Nandrolone only cycle, there's plenty of people who follow this protocol with subclinical testosterone, estradiol, and low DHEA and pregnenolone levels, but feel perfectly happy like that. So if that's the approach that you're going for, you're using Nandrolone as a base because you're not responding well to testosterone and estradiol, you might still want to have some estradiol in the picture for all the benefits which are associated with estradiol. That's why a lot of people that run Nandrolone-only cycles look into Dianabol instead. Dianabol metabolizes into methyl estradiol, which is not bioidentical to estradiol. It's methylated estradiol, obviously, and it doesn't really fulfill the same physiological functions as estradiol itself. It has lower binding affinity for the estrogen receptors, but it's metabolism resistant. So a low dose of 10 to 20 milligrams Dianabol per day in many cases supply sufficient amounts of methyl estradiol to replace part of the physiological functions which are desired and associated with estradiol itself by offering some methyl estradiol in return. Again, I don't think that Dianabol as a base alongside of Nandrolone is a sustainable option because it raises your liver enzymes. And I don't think that the methyl estradiol is potent enough to offset the cholesterol synthesis in the liver, which Dianabol potentiates, right? Which will also lower sex hormone binding globulin. So it's like dual signals. And who's going to win? The full dose of Dianabol or whatever gets converted into methyl estradiol? Fingers crossed that it's able to mitigate some of these effects. And if you absolutely must run a Nandrolone only cycle, that's your base anabolic, replacing testosterone, I would look into injectable estradiol, Valerate, or Benzoate instead of dosing oral SERMs or Dianabol. Now, the dosing protocol is a little bit difficult to determine because everybody metabolizes estradiol, Valerate, or Benzoate slightly different. Some people respond well to 0.25 milligrams estradiol, benzoate, or Valerate injected subcutaneously every day. Some people respond better to 0.5 milligrams. So that's almost a dose that you would otherwise find in a birth control tablet, which contains ethinyl estradiol, which I don't think is a suitable replacement dose because a lot of that converts into estrone in the liver, right? Oral birth control tablets are taken orally, passing through the liver, and sublingual doesn't seem to be that well absorbed. So if you must run Nandrolone only cycle, I think the best option that you have to fulfill some of the physiological functions associated with estradiol is going to be injectable estradiol, Valerate, or Benzoate. And again, if you don't respond well to estradiol itself, then a SERM or Dianabol taken orally might be the last option available to you to sustain part of the things which should otherwise be coming from estradiol in your bloodstream. Right? So a lot of things that can be considered a base. There's so many different bodies on this planet. You're going to have to figure out which protocol is best for you. So for me personally, that would be a combination of exogenous testosterone plus ACG or HMG. I wish HMG was available to me, but I'm still looking, so I'm running ACG instead. And at higher dosages of testosterone, I feel that ACG is no longer effective for me, or HMG is no longer effective for me, right? Depending on the dose. And then I would look into DHEA and pregnenolone supplementation instead to sustain the neurosteroid balance to the sex hormones. Really hope this helps, guys. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you're looking for the most comprehensive guides to bodybuilding pharmacology, you can find the ebooks on my website, vigoroussteve.com/shop. Personalized advice always available through consultations. You can find the rates in the consultations section. Follow me on Instagram at VigorSteve. Vigorous crew, you guys know what to do. Front double bicep for you guys. The base in this picture is Test and ACG with some Primobolan sprinkled on top. Works well for me. Maybe it will work well for you as well. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.